The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The 100 Tales of Wisdom by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. If God Wills. It is also narrated that one day Maulana asked his servant, one Sheikh Muhammad, to perform a certain task, to which the servant replied, "Yes, inshallah, yes, if God wills." At once Maulana yelled, "You fool! Who but God's manifestation orders you to do this task?" Here the allusion is not that Maulana claimed to be divine, but that, according to the mystical idea, God's attributes are so closely identified with man's actions, and he is so much under the governance of God's will and purpose, that the man is nothing but an instrument of his manifestation, being the best of the creation, and that oneness of all things that exist make the infinite as one with all that was, is, and will be. The servant was overwhelmed with the force of the spiritual command, and asked to be forgiven. Mystical rapture. It is likewise narrated that one day Mu'inuddin had invited a number of notables, and the Sultan also was present, the major guest being Maulana. The mystical audition lasted until well past midnight, and perhaps one of the disciples had whispered to the host that if the audition was terminated, the people might snatch some sleep. Without knowing what was said, Maulana asked for the sound to cease, but whilst others began to rest, one named Sheikh Abdur Rahman Syed still was shouting loudly in a kind of ecstasy. The Sultan whispered to one that Abdur Rahman was showing strange manners, that although all had been resting or trying to sleep, Abdur Rahman still continued to yell and shout. "And," said the Sultan, "is that dervish a greater person to be moved with the occasion than Maulana, who was silent and reposeful?" To which Maulana observed that in the heart of some were earthly desires like monstrous dragons, which would not allow them to rest or come forward like other disciples to gain mystical refinement, for the dragon continued to pull them aside. The Sultan was so impressed that he begged to be admitted into the ranks of the disciples. Calling upon Maulana. It is also narrated that the reason of the eventual dismantling of the house of the Seljuks was this, that the Sultan had become a humble disciple of Maulana and had considered Maulana his spiritual father. But slowly his allegiance became suspect, for he had been made to pay much greater attention to one who was a mere showman in matters of mystical performance. A group of men of much less religious importance had praised this man so highly that the Sultan inclined towards him more and more. One day, however, a breaking point arrived, for the Sultan invited a number of highly placed men, including Maulana, and pronounced that he, the Sultan, had thenceforward accepted the spiritual guidance of the other man, named as Sheikh Baba Marvizi, in preference to Maulana, and that from that date onward Marvizi was his spiritual father. A public affront of this kind quite naturally affected Maulana, who said that if the Sultan had taken another as his spiritual father, then he, too, would seek another spiritual son, and left the gathering. It is also narrated that Chalabi Hisamuddin reported that as he left the Sultan's gathering along with Maulana, he experienced a vision that the Sultan was standing without his head, as if the Sultan's head were cut off. And although many men of learning ran after the enraged Maulana, he did not return to the king's meeting. After a few days, the Sultan invited the more important divines to perform an incense-burning ceremony so that the danger of the Mongol invasion might be averted. After this ceremony, the king came to seek the blessing of Maulana, for he was then going to face the Mongols. Maulana advised that the king should not go, but as the news of the danger was insistent, he had no option but to go and face the enemy. But before he launched out far, he met his fate. When he reached Aksaray and was putting on his bow and arrow case, they strangled him, and he is said to have called for help from Maulana. It so happened that at that hour Maulana was in an ecstasy of mystic songs, and during the performance asked a lute to be brought to him, with which he plugged his ear. Another was placed on the other ear of Maulana, and then he could hear nothing, it is said. A little later, he placed his wrap in the archway and invited his disciples to perform with him the prayers for the dead. At the conclusion of all this, the disciples wished to be enlightened as to why their master had plugged his ears and had performed the rites for the dead. And he replied, "I had made my ears soundproof because I heard the cry of the king, though the scene was many miles away, who was beseeching me for my help, and I could not help, because it was but the will of God that he should die." This was the same sultan who had taken another man as his spiritual father, despite the fact that he had been previously accepted as the spiritual son by Maulana, and he publicly affronted the master. And the prayer was for the soul of the man. The mysterious flight. It is also narrated that sometime prior to this happening, at a mystical audition meeting, Maulana sat with the disciples from early forenoon to late at night. Towards the conclusion of this meeting, the saintly Chalabi Hisamuddin felt very sleepy. Noticing this, Maulana spread his mantle for him to recline upon, and Chalabi dropped off to sleep. During this sleep he dreamt that a large white bird came and took him in its talons, and flew to regions far above the earth, so high that the earth appeared as a small speck. In that region the bird descended on the top of a mountain as fertile and full of vegetation as if God had created it from a large piece of green jewel. On the top of that mountain Chalabi saw a head like a human head, and thereupon the bird gave a sword into the hand of Chalabi, saying that he should cut the throat of that head, which, added the bird, was the command of God. Chalabi asked the bird who he was, and received the reply that the bird was a companion of Gabriel. Chalabi, having performed the action asked for, was lifted by the bird and deposited on the very spot on earth from which he had flown upwards. When Chalabi awoke, he saw Maulana standing beside him. Part of a greater whole. It is also narrated that once Sheikh Mahmud Najjar, the saintly, related that on an occasion Maulana was giving a discourse on matters of the high philosophy of mystic thought, when the great sage Shamsuddin arrived on the scene, and Maulana welcomed him by saying, "He, the sage, often speaks about God and his manifestations, and now on this occasion he, the sage, will hear of God directly through one inspired. And, said Maulana, a day will come when God's words will be known directly without a sheikh as an interpreter, because the real sheikh is he alone, and he is he and the sheikh are one. And the oneness means that the disciples and the sheikhs are all part of a greater whole, and that and this and he and who are but words and mere illusions." And he recited the following couplet. He, the greatest of all kings, men thought was behind the doors in the locked house of existence. But donning the robes of a dervish, a voice can convey the meaning of the greatest of all. It is also narrated that Sheikh Mahmud related that one day there was a meeting of mystical audition in the seminary of Sheikh Sadruddin, and Maulana attended the meeting, and the sound swelled to an extraordinary degree, lifting the atmosphere of feeling to high levels. Kamaluddin suggested that with all the greatness of Maulana, his disciples did not include men of high status, but were either carpenters or tailors or craftsmen of humbler origin. When the remark was conveyed to Maulana, he called loudly to Kamaluddin and said, "If that be so, Mansur was not a man of great public importance from the wealth point of view, nor was Sheikh Abu Bakr, not the Caliph, who was but a carpenter. And yet after the name of these men you say, blessed be their names, and that was because they were men of great mystical attainments. In what way did their humbler callings detract from their spiritual attainments?" The one who had made the comment felt very ashamed of himself and asked for forgiveness. Shocks. It is likewise narrated that on one occasion a man named Kamal, meaning perfection, in a meeting turned his back towards the humbler disciples of Maulana and took little notice of them. Maulana did not like it and shouted, "Oh, you Bey Kamal!" Bey makes a negative of Kamal, that is, without excellence, a play upon words. And the voice of Maulana terrified him to the extent that he, Kamaluddin, fell to the stone floor and grievously hurt his head and asked for forgiveness. Maulana forgave the man and bestowed upon him his cloak and a turban, and he became a devout disciple. Humility. It is likewise narrated that one of the discourses of Maulana emphasized the virtue and necessity of humbleness of bearing in life. He said that trees which shoot up in the air and pride themselves only on their height may have no fruits, but those which give fruit have their boughs weighed down with the fruit and the nobility thereof. It was for that reason that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was polite and humble to a high degree, and thus excelled other prophets in this respect, and in being a true dervish. And he said, "Always deal with people with courtesy and humbleness, and see that none is hurt by you, materially or mentally." And therefore, when during an attack which enemies made upon him they broke one of the Prophet's teeth, he only prayed to God to direct his people towards the right path. For he added, "They do not know the right path." And of course, in place of cursing them or praying to have the wrath of God to be brought down upon them, he loved them and only asked not for their destruction, but for their being guided to the right path, and he himself forgave them. It is said, therefore, that before the Prophet none sought peacefulness for mankind more earnestly, and Maulana recited, "Man is made of clay, and if there may not be clay, with what would a man be fashioned?" Here the allusion to clay is meant that clay and earth are always below and not above, such as the air and light and atmosphere, and therefore clay is situated in a humbler position, and remains in a humbler position, not like fire that rises up with pride and arrogance. The point being that as man is created from clay, he should always be in control of his ego, and not hold himself up with arrogance and pride of place. Thus, humbleness is both a natural station of human beings and a virtue. This humbleness, however, does not mean self-effacement, for individuality must be preserved, as the tall trees preserve their height. But height alone is not virtue. Therefore, to add to the height and add fruit to the height, humbleness is enjoined in Sufi behavior, in both thought and action. Courtesy. It is also narrated that another characteristic of Maulana was that he was very fond of little children and very old women, and gave extra thought to them, showing courtesy and love to them. He carried this practice towards everyone, irrespective of religious association or race or station in life, and treated them even with respect. For instance, once a very aged Christian Armenian woman crossed his path. Seeing her bent form, Maulana stopped and bared his head before her in respect, and bowed towards her 7 times, whereupon the aged woman did the same towards the master sage. It is narrated also that Maulana used to show the utmost politeness to little children and old women, even if they were not of the faith, and used to bless them. Thus it was that one day an Armenian by the name of Tumbal, or Lazy, crossed his path, and Maulana showed a very respectful attitude towards him, and he saluted him 7 times. So did Maulana an equal number of times. Likewise, it is narrated that one day Maulana was passing through a street, and saw a group of children there at play, who, seeing Maulana, ran up to him and saluted him, to which Maulana responded with affection. One small child, seeing Maulana and not having joined the group, shouted that they might wait until he arrived. Maulana awaited the small urchin's convenience. People used to accuse Maulana of having strayed from the right path in his mystical practices, and strongly objected to the plays and song and music of his meetings. But to all these objections Maulana said nothing, and these objectors have disappeared from the scene of life as if they never have been, whereas the teachings of Maulana will remain to the end of time. It is also narrated that one day a disciple held a meeting of spiritual song in honor of Maulana, and Maulana, upon arriving at the gateway of his host, waited until everyone had entered. Then Maulana entered the house, and the meeting was held with great effect and zest, and Maulana stayed the night at his host's house, who greatly rejoiced that such a master had honored him. The saintly Hisamuddin had asked why Maulana waited outside until everybody else had gone in, to which he replied that he did so because if he had gone in first, then the gatekeepers would have stopped others from entering the house out of respect to him. His poorer disciples would thus have been prevented from having access to him and profiting from his preaching and prayers. He added that if he could not get his poorer disciples entry into the houses of his rich disciples, how could he hope to gain admittance for such men with little material influence into paradise? What he actually meant was that in this life where materialism is predominant, men are measured according to their wealth and riches, and that men with less wealth, if not admitted to his meetings because these men were poor, would be deprived of the blessings of prayer and devotion to be performed at his meetings, and at which these poor men could not take a part. If they thus did not take part, it is obvious that their chances of admittance to paradise would be less. Maulana, therefore, gave a chance to these poorer elements of his fraternity to gain virtue by joining him in prayer and devotional audition meetings, and waited for them to enter the hall of the rich man first, fearing that if he went in first, the door would be shut, and the poorer people would not be allowed in. The disciples, appreciating the consideration given to the humblest of them by Maulana, thanked him greatly. Forgiveness. It is also related that one day Maulana had sent a recommendation to a noble disciple, the Parvana, to forgive a man who had committed a murder, to which the man replied, saying that the matter was beyond his competence. And Maulana wrote back to say that a man who commits a murder is one who takes a life, and he is to be called the son of Azrael, the angel of death, who takes people's lives. Therefore, the Maulana argued, such a man being the son of such a one cannot but take life, for that is his function. The other was amused by the argument and allowed that the man might be released if the murdered person's relatives would accept compensation. Here it by no means signifies that Maulana in any way condoned such crimes, but it is an indication that he pointed to the fact that a person can be released by law if his relatives are satisfied with blood money, an accepted rule of law of the time and place. The inward eye. It is also narrated that Maulana Shamsuddin Multi reported that one day Maulana was giving a discourse of mystical subjects at the seminary, when he said that he loved Shamsuddin much, but he had one fault, and then Shamsuddin begged to be enlightened as to what that fault was. And Maulana said, "Whatever he, Shamsuddin, perceives and sees, he thinks that God's most blessed thing and God's most blessed person is that thing or that person." And then Maulana recited these verses. As many a man has the inwardness of Satan, should one hail everyone as a saint? When your inward eye is opened, the real master can then be perceived. The marketplace. Thereafter, Shamsuddin became a more devoted disciple, and agreed that it was true what Maulana had said, that as he had the urge of a seeker, he did actually seek the company of every seeming master. But what Maulana said had opened his eyes towards the reality of a true master. On that day, Maulana recited the following verse, and ordered all his disciples to commit it to memory. It read, "In this marketplace of the occult medicine sellers, do not run hither and thither to every shop, but rather sit at the booth of one who has the real remedy to give." Self-deception. It is also narrated that one day Maulana was giving a mystical discourse in relation to the statement of the great master Bayezid, peace be upon his soul, that he acclaimed the Prophet Muhammad not only because of the Prophet's miracle of the division of the moon, the coming together of trees, or the voice of the vegetation, but more especially because of his prohibiting the use of alcohol to his followers. For whosoever performs an act of virtue gains more virtue if he is the first to act in that manner. Because if he had seen any benefit in drinking wine, he would have done it himself first. But as the Prophet was the disciple of God, he obeyed God, and taught the men of his faith to act likewise, and he recited the following couplet. "If only you might abstain from wine only a day or two, that is but a self-deception, you will forfeit heaven's light in that which is wine, because universally it is bad and wicked, thus to all it is rendered forbidden." This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.